They're not the first civilization because everyone else was a savage before them. Civilization doesn't emerge all of a sudden. Civilization is the culmination of a very long process. It starts with the very primitive people who came out of Africa, with the hunter gatherers, with the pastoralists, with the first farmers in the Fertile Crescent, with the first elements of the Ubaid culture who decided to harness the power of the waters of the Tigris and the Euphrates. We call the Sumerians the first civilization because many things that were in the works, many things that were evolving prior to the Sumerians, only become crystallized when the Sumerians emerge, when they appear in history. And what are these elements that we call civilization? First, civilization cannot happen without cities. The term civilization comes from the Latin civitas, which means city. The first real cities in history appear in Mesopotamia, built by the Sumerians, probably around 4500 BC. These are planned cities. There's a layout. And that means that before they were built, someone with enough authority said, this is the way that we will build it. So civilization implies an organized government. It implies a society that is organized at different levels, where different members of that society have different economic, social, and political functions. It means organized religion. It means a view of life and of the world that is guided towards a common goal. The Sumerians are the first ones to create real cities with a real government, with a real social structure, with a real organized religion, with a technology that enables them to have a kind of life that, even though was very different from what we live today, we can still identify with. There's something about us in the ancient Sumerians when we look at what was important to them. Of course, they were very different in terms of the way in which they viewed the world. But the elements of every great civilization were already there in the Sumerians. The organization of the Sumerians, in terms of political structure, is based on something called the city-state. The first political entities in history were not countries, were not empires. They were cities that functioned for all practical purposes as a state, meaning that they had their own rulers, their own laws, their own social organization, and their own territory. Right here we have an artistic reconstruction of the city of Mari. Mari was actually a Semitic city. It was not necessarily a Sumerian city, but I think it's the layout that the artist has imagined is fantastic, and it illustrates what a city-state is. As you can see in the center, you have some public buildings, you have houses, you have 2 layers of walls and gardens within the city itself, and then you have a canal that cuts through, which was probably built by, not probably, was certainly built by the people of Mari to draw the waters of the river Euphrates into their city. And outside the city, what do we see? Fields. This is the source of food. This is the source of wealth of the city. So the city-state is the city itself, the buildings, the public buildings, the dwellings of the people, and the surrounding territory, which is used for agriculture, is part of that city-state. If you were to walk for perhaps a day or two in any direction, you would encounter another city-state. In southern Mesopotamia, actually today would be central Mesopotamia because of different geographic changes, the center of what we call Sumer, there were probably about 3 dozen city-states. Some quite small, maybe about 10,000 people, others quite large, like Ur or Uruk, with 40, 50, 70,000 people. Sometimes it's difficult to determine that because the archaeological remains cannot tell us everything, but some of the cities were quite large. And we can tell that because you see some monumental construction, some huge buildings, some temples that would require tremendous amount of labor. So the city-state is the political foundation of the Sumerian civilization. Each city is independent from each other. How is this city run? Well, in the beginning, these cities were run by individuals called ensis. An ensi is part ruler, part high priest. In the religion of the Sumerians, there are many gods, but each city had a patron god or goddess. That god or goddess was considered the owner of the city, and the ensi, who was the high priest of that god or goddess, is considered the representative of that god on earth. Therefore, his functions are religious and they are also political. It is not certain, but we think that these ensis did not have absolute power over the city in those early stages. It is not certain either whether they had hereditary power, meaning that they could pass on their position to their sons. Obviously, there was some sort of council that co-rule with the ensi at that point. Eventually, however, there's a transformation, and ensis are replaced by lugals. A lugal is a great lord. It's a king. This is someone who has absolute power over the city. He still has some religious functions, but his primary role is that of a political leader. He makes the laws. He has power over life and death. He makes war or peace against his neighbors. He controls the army. He passes on his power to his son. So the Lugal has hereditary power. These kings are still connected to the concept of the god owning the city, but these kings make decisions that are very much practical, political. In terms of social organization, what did the Sumerian social structure look like? At the top, you have two segments, the nobility and the priests. The nobility comes from the warrior class. It is believed that in early societies, those who were able to fight eventually became the owners of the land. And this is the case in Sumerian cities. There's a warrior class that also controls the land. Along with them, there's another class of people called priests. There are many temples in the city. There's obviously one main temple dedicated to the patron god or goddess of the city, but there are other temples. And these temples conduct a lot of activity. First, they are in charge of praying and offering sacrifices to the gods. You need the favor of the gods to survive. You depend on agriculture. You depend on the waters. You depend on your crops not being attacked by a plague. And therefore, the offering of rituals and sacrifices to the gods, and by sacrifices I mean animal sacrifices, material offerings. We are beyond human sacrifice here. There's no evidence of human sacrifices practiced here. So you have to constantly practice these rituals so that the gods are happy with you. And that is extremely important. The priests have other function also. The temple or the temples or the temple system, if we want to call them that, is in charge of the storage, recording, and distribution of grain. And we'll talk a little more about that later. So at the top, you have the nobility, and you have the priests. The king comes from the nobility. He is a military commander as well as the political leader of the city-state. Anyone who is not a nobleman or who is not a priest is a commoner. And within this very wide class, you have people who are temple officials. These are people who know how to read and write and keep records, very important. You have merchants, people who trade, sometimes within the city, sometimes among the different cities. Sometimes they practice long distance trade. Some of them are quite wealthy. You have craftsmen, people who manufacture goods, baskets, pottery, weapons, tools, buildings. They are construction workers. Anyone who works his hands or her hands and produces goods is a craftsman. Fishermen. Fishing is a very important activity, especially in a place where you have a lot of lakes and rivers and canals. They are also part of the commoner class. And the biggest segment within the commoner class is the farmers. About 80% of the population in Sumerian cities was constituted by farmers. And this figure of 80% is pretty regular throughout the world and throughout history up until industrial times. Even a place like China, 100 years ago, had a population that was mostly concentrated in the countryside. And the reason for this is that the methods of agriculture were not as efficient as they are today. So you needed a lot of labor. At least 80% of the population had to be engaged in the production of food to feed 100% of the population. The farmers do not own the land. It is believed that the condition was that of serfdom. What is a serf? A serf is a peasant who is attached to the land where he works or attached to an estate. What does that mean? It means that if that estate, which is owned by a nobleman, for example, is sold, he comes with the estate. However, a serf is not a slave. He's not property. The owner of the land cannot beat him up. The owner of the land cannot kill him. The owner of the land cannot take his children and sell them. The serf is not free, but he's not a slave. He enters into a compact, so to speak, with the owner of the land, with the owner of the state. And this is the deal. The serf can never leave. On the other hand, the owner of that estate can never kick out the serf and his family from the land. And what happens is that at the end of the year, when grain is produced, a share of that goes to the owner of the land, and a share goes to the serf, to the farmer. And this is going to be recorded in the official granaries of the city, which are managed by the priests. In a place like Mesopotamia, where the land is quite fertile, the serfs live a very good life. If we talk about serfs in the Middle Ages, that's different. If you talk about serfs in Russia in the 1700s, their condition is horrible, probably as bad in some cases as the condition of slaves in the southern United States. But in this particular point in time, let's say 3500, 3000 BC, the serfs have enough food to provide to the owner of the land and enough food to for their families to eat. And sometimes they have enough food to even sell as a surplus. And then you have another class of people at the bottom, slaves. Slavery was part of ancient societies. It was certainly part of the Sumerian structure. A slave is not really integrated into the social structure because the slave is property. How do you become a slave? The easiest way to become a slave is if your city-state goes to war, you lose, and you're captured. Slaves are often used as servants. If you have a pottery-making business, you may have a slave to help you with the work, for example. Another way of becoming a slave is if you owe money and you cannot pay it back. And of course, when I talk about money, I'm talking about an abstract concept because actual money, actual currency did not exist at that time. Another way to become a slave is if you are captured by slave hunters. And there is some evidence that there were people going out into the mountains around Mesopotamia hunting for people to be sold as slaves. One of the terms for slave in ancient Mesopotamia was mountain man or mountain woman. What is the economic system of Sumer like? The economy was based on agriculture, farming. About 80% of the people in Sumerian cities were dedicated to producing food. And by farming, I mean not only harvest, but also animal husbandry. That is the raising of animals for either consumption in terms of the meat or their milk or harvesting their wool. Because Sumer was so efficient at producing food, because Sumer was so efficient in terms of agriculture, they were able to have not only enough food to feed their populations, but they had surpluses. And that surplus helped them trade with other cities and with regions far away. In addition to producing food, the Sumerian craftsmen, the Sumerian artisans, were able to produce goods that could also be exported. So, in terms of trade, the Sumerians exported fish. Now, how do you export fish? Fish goes bad, right? Well, you dry the fish, and once the fish is dry, you're able to transport it to places where there are no lakes or rivers. They exported wool, and of course, they exported grain, barley, and wheat, in addition to goods that were manufactured by their very skilled artisans. In terms of their imports, they imported metals like copper and tin and timber. There are no trees in Mesopotamia, so they have to trade with people on the hills and the mountains in order to bring these very essential materials. The Sumerian economy is also based on a centralized system of the distribution of grain, the granary. The granary is run very often by the temples, and this is a place where farmers come and deposit what they have harvested. The officials record how much they harvested. The officials report what field this harvest belongs to, who was the owner, and who was the serf or serfs working on that specific field. These records are very important because then it enables the people who are either the owners of the land or the farmers attached to the production to withdraw grain when it is needed, either for consumption or for sale. Sumer was not isolated. And this is very important to keep in mind. We think of the Sumerians as these people who emerge out of nowhere and they produce this magnificent civilization in isolation. No, that's not the case. The Sumerians were the product of Mesopotamia and the surrounding area. They learned from others, they brought ideas from others. And at the same time, during the time that they flourished, they were able to export those ideas. They were able to export goods, and with their goods came cultural traits. There is evidence that the inhabitants of southern Mesopotamia traded with the inhabitants of the civilizations along the Indus Valley in what today is India and Pakistan. There are a lot of similarities between the two civilizations, and we are certain that they both learn something from each other. So, to summarize, Sumerian cities were independent from each other. They were organized into city-states, first ruled by ensis, who were priests and rulers, who did not have absolute power, later ruled by lugals, who were kings with absolute power over the cities. They had a social structure where the nobility and the priests were at the top, and everyone else was part of what we call the commoner class. At the heart of this society was the temple. In this case, we have an image of a ziggurat in the city of Ur. The term ziggurat is a Sumerian term for a particular type of temple, kind of pyramidal in its structure, as you can see on this image. And this temple was not only a center of worship, but it was also an administrative body that stored, recorded, and distributed grain. The Sumerians had a very diversified economy. Aside from farming, they traded, they produced manufacturing. And the Sumerians were not an isolated civilization. They were deeply connected to the civilizations and groups that lived around them. Now we're going to talk about some of the cultural contributions of the Sumerians. And perhaps the most important contribution of the Sumerians in this field was writing. Writing was first developed around the year 3500 BC. This early form of writing that you see in this image is called cuneiform. The term cuneiform means in the form or in the shape of a wedge. And what happens is that as the system developed, the symbols had little wedges, In Latin, the term for wedge is cunus, so therefore cuneiform means in the shape of a wedge. It took a long time for this system to evolve. And like everything else with the Sumerians, they did not invent this out of nothing. There were some cultural trends that existed prior to the arrival of the Sumerians. People were writing symbols to represent ideas or objects. And eventually, they developed a fully functional system that combined symbols that represented sounds, symbols that represented words, symbols that represented concepts, symbols that represented grammatical features of the word. And when they combined that, they developed what linguists call a logographic system. A logographic system combines phonetic, symbolic, visual elements into one system. The system of the Sumerians was a logographic system, and it consisted of about 600 symbols. It is very important to note that these symbols are not letters. In our alphabet, we have 26 letters. Each letter represents a sound. The beauty of the alphabetic system, which was invented much, much later, is that it's adaptable to every single language. It is very economical, 26 letters representing sounds. And virtually everyone with a little time and effort and education can learn how to read and write. The cuneiform system is different. As I said before, some symbols represented sounds, some symbols represented words, some syllables, some concepts. In this image, for example, you see the name of a ruler. And as you can see, there is no left or right, it's actually up and down. If you look at the symbol at the top, it looks like an asterisk. This symbol initially represented a star. Eventually, it became a symbol for God. Sometimes it was used as a symbol for sky. In this case, the name of the ruler appears, and by adding that symbol, you still pronounce the name of the ruler in the same way, Naram-Sin. And Naram-Sin is a king, but by placing that asterisk, it means that he is divine. And of course, they do not mean literally that he is a god, but there's a divine element to him because he is the ruler in the name of the god who owns the land. As you can see, the cuneiform script is extremely complicated, and that means that you have to start early on to learn it. By the time that you are fluent, that you are very proficient, actually, I should say, in the use of this system, you can be employed by the temple, you can be employed by the government to become a bureaucrat, an administrator. And these people were essential for the functioning of the Sumerian city-state. It was a highly valued and valuable skill. How do we know about this? How do we know how to read this cuneiform system? Well, there's a very long story on how it is to come that we know how to read cuneiform. In the 19th century, this inscription was discovered by the British. It's called the Bishtun inscription, and it is located in an area of Persia or Iran. Iran is a very ancient country, it's an ancient civilization, and they are very close to Mesopotamia. They are close neighbors to the area where civilization started. And of course, they developed their own civilizations. This inscription is from the time of King Darius the Great. Very famous because he's the one who initiated the attacks against the Greeks, and we'll talk more about him later in the semester. If you look close to the inscription, it's located on a cliff, so as passerbys can look at it. It represents the king with his servants, and you can tell who the king is, right? Because he's taller than everyone else. And on top of the king, there's a symbol. It's almost like a figure with wings, and that is a symbol for Ahura Mazda. Ahura Mazda was the god of a religion called Zoroastrianism, which was a religion of the Persians. When we talk about the Persian Empire, we will discuss more in detail what Zoroastrianism was about. And this inscription glorifies Ahura Mazda, and it is an homage of King Darius to the god that he and his people worship. As you look close to the inscription, you can see that it's written, is chiseled into the rock in advanced cuneiform. So this cuneiform, as you can see, doesn't look like the early, very pictographic cuneiform developed early by the Sumerians. By this point, the cuneiform that was used was very technical, and you can see the typical wedges in each of the symbols that give the name to the system. What is important about this inscription is that since Darius ruled over a vast empire with people speaking many languages, the inscription was written in 3 different languages. It was written in Old Babylonian, it was written in Elamite, and it was written in Old Persian. Persian, of course, is the language of the Persians. Elamite is the language of a group of people who live south of, west of the Persians, and they were part of their empire since the beginning. And Old Babylonian is the language that was spoken in the city of Babylon, closely connected to Akkadian, which is another important classical language of the ancient Middle East. Old Babylonian and Elamite disappeared as languages historically. Old Persian, however, evolved, and it is the ancestor of modern Persian or Farsi, the language that 70 million people, I think, or is that the population of Iran today, is a language of Iranians today. Modern Persian or Farsi is then connected to Old Persian. The relationship between modern Persian and Old Persian is like the relationship between modern Italian, French, or Spanish to Latin, the language spoken by the Romans. So even if you don't take Latin classes, but you speak Italian or Romanian or French or Portuguese or Spanish, and you look at a Latin text, you can understand some words. It is the same thing here. If you speak modern Farsi, you can actually see some of the roots of your language in Old Persian. But more importantly, in the case of Latin, no one speaks Latin as a first language today, but the knowledge of Latin has been preserved through culture, through the practices of the Catholic Church. The use of Latin never stopped, even though it was not the language of people. The same thing with Old Persian. Throughout the history of Persia, from ancient times to modern times, over the course of 3,000 years, as Persian language evolved into modern Farsi or Persian, the knowledge of Old Persian was never lost. And that means that this Bishtun inscription enables us, through our knowledge of modern and ancient Persian, to figure out what these other languages are, Elamite and Old Babylonian. In this image, we see the actual transcription of the Bishtun inscription. And this inscription is important because it was the foundational point of of the process of learning all the ancient languages that were at one point spoken and written in the Middle East. In addition to the Bishtun inscription, archaeologists found the Royal Library of Nineveh in Assyria, what today is modern-day Iraq, in the north of the country. In this library, they encountered tablets that had been buried for 2,600 years. And some of these tablets were dictionaries, basically lists of words and how they were their equivalent in other languages. There were tablets with descriptions of the grammars of some of these languages. There were bilingual tablets in Akkadian and Sumerian, Akkadian and Old Babylonian, Assyrian and Old Babylonian. There in Egypt, they found tablets of correspondence between Egyptian kings and people of the Middle East. So the Egyptian kings would write these tablets in cuneiform, but in an official transcript, they would write the information in Egyptian and in the language of the people they were addressing. So when you put all of these archaeological findings together, over the course of many generations and the work of many, many cryptologists, a cryptologist is someone who studies, who deciphers ancient inscriptions and languages related to them, linguists, all of this work put together enables us today to read any document written in the Middle East throughout its history, whether it's written in Sumerian, Akkadian, Gutian, Babylonian, Assyrian, Persian, Elamine, Hittite, Hurrian, Urartian. I could go on and on and on, just giving you names of different civilizations that had different languages but used cuneiform to express their ideas, to record their harvests, to record their political or military events. It is truly an amazing accomplishment on the part of archaeologists and cryptologists and linguists to have been able to decipher all of these languages that were written and spoken at one point over the course of thousands of years. Another important accomplishment of the Sumerians was the development of a numerical system. Numbers are very important for trade. And the Sumerians developed a system called the sexagesimal system because it is based on multiples of the number 60. Right here, you see a fully developed system. Of course, like everything else, it didn't start out this way, but eventually evolved into what you see in this image. One little stick with a wedge for number 1, 2 for number 2, 3 for number 3, 4 for number 4, and so on and so forth. When you get to 10, it changes, right? So each 10 you have a different symbol, and you have one symbol for every number up to 59. So what do you do once you want to count beyond that? Well, they had a positional system. Just like in our system, we use the decimal system, right? And our system is based on multiples of 10. So if you have the number 123, what does that mean? It means that there are 3 units on the first column from the right. There are the 2 on the second column means 2 times 10, right? So it represents actually 20. And the 1 on the third column represents 100. So if you add 100 plus 20 plus 3 is 123. And obviously with the decimal system, we can write any number. In the sexagesimal system, the concept is similar. So the first column would give you every number until 50. You can write any number in that column up to 59. When you get to the next column, that column represents the column of the 60s. And then the one next to it is the column of 60 times 6, which is 360. And so on and so forth. So this system enables you to write any number that you want. There are vestiges of this system today. We still use this system when measuring circles, 360 degrees. And of course, every single second of our time, we are using the system. Each minute has 60 seconds. Each hour has 60 minutes. So the sexagesimal system is still with us in some aspects. The Sumerians are also the fathers of accounting. Accounting was crucial for the Sumerians because this is how they recorded the harvest. This is how they distributed the most important commodity, which was grain. Right here you see a tablet from the Ur-3 period, which is around 2100 BC. If you look at this next tablet, these tablets are called tokens. It basically represents the harvest in a specific field and who is connected to that. It looks misshapen today because it is more than 4,000 years old. But you can imagine that it was a little square, right? It's in 3 dimensions. So this little tablet records the field where the grain was produced, who produced it, and who is the owner of that field. And of course, if you stand the tablet and put it on its side, it has a it gives you a reference of what the content is. On this tablet, what we see is a summary of all the tablets contained on a certain file at the granary. That means that if you went to the granary and you want to withdraw grain, the official can go to the summary, read the summary of what your actual token contains. This summary gives you the location of the other tablet that I showed you before. The official goes, retrieves that tablet, and then he knows how much grain the person who is in front of him has and how much he can withdraw. It is like a bank. In the old days, when you had a bank account, you had something called a passbook. So every time that you went to deposit money in the bank, they would put the amount of money that you have on your passbook. And then when you went to the bank to withdraw, you would show your passbook, and then they would deduct what you had withdrawn. It works like that. A very efficient system. So writing for the Sumerians was created for very practical purposes. Of course, once you invent writing, you realize that the possibilities are infinite. Kings can record their accomplishments, the battles that they won, the birth of their children, the time when they came to power. People can record poetry. People can record the stories about the gods. Literature is born. So writing basically expands the possibilities of human expression. And it is very important because writing enables us now in the present to look back and speak with our ancestors, hear from them what they accomplished. In terms of technology, the Sumerians are also the inventors of the wheel. And I have to put an asterisk on this because the wheel was invented by many people in different places at different points in history. But in terms of the Sumerians, they developed a wheel that was functional and they applied that wheel to a very practical task. This is called the Standard of Ur. This is an inlaid depiction of a king with his army. And in this standard, you see several chariots made of wood with wooden wheels. These chariots are heavy. If you look at this image right here, the chariot had a driver, and along with the driver, there was a warrior who had javelins and spears to fight his enemy. The animals that you see hauling the chariot are not horses. Horses had not yet been domesticated during Sumerian times. They are onagers. An onager is a kind of wild donkey that was domesticated in that part of the world, and they were used. So these chariots were heavy, they were slow, but it was a tremendous technological advance for the time. Those wheels seemed heavy, and they were very heavy. They were not the best types of wheels. This chariot had no suspension. It was probably a very rough ride. Still, the concept is there, and this technology eventually was refined to produce very fast chariots, especially in Central Asia. The Indo-Europeans mastered that technique. But once you have the concept of the wheel, you also have the concept of wagons that can hold merchandise. So a very important invention. And as I said before, other civilizations at different times in history, they came up with the same ideas. Interestingly enough, in the Americas, some of the civilizations invented wheels and they used them for toys, but they never employed them in carts. And the reason for that is that in the New World, in the Americas, there were no draft animals. And therefore, there was no use for them, at least from that conceptual point, to apply that invention to something that was on a bigger scale. Another great contribution of the Sumerians was the development of irrigation. And I have to repeat this, like everything else, they did not invent irrigation, they just perfected it. They made it into something quite systematic that increasingly produce more food, enable populations to grow. Basically, the wealth of Mesopotamia is based not on just its natural conditions, but the way in which humans modified their environment. And here we see an image of a river and how irrigation can expand the amount of land that you can cultivate. Irrigation means building canals, dikes, reservoirs. One of the big problems in Mesopotamia is that the rivers overflow every year, but they overflow at the wrong time of the year. So if you were to plant something, the inundations, the floods would destroy your crops. So the Sumerians and in general the inhabitants of Mesopotamia had to devise systems to control the flow of waters, to protect the fields when they needed to be protected from floods, and to store water in reservoirs, to create artificial lakes so that when they needed water to irrigate their fields, they could open dikes and the canals would bring the water through the places that they needed to. Irrigation transformed the landscape of Mesopotamia, and it built the material wealth of many of these cities. And here we have a fantastic invention. It's called the shaduf. This is something that you see in both. One is an illustration, and this is a photograph. It's still used in many parts of the world. It is the same concept used when you go through the gate of a parking lot and you have something stopping, right? And it lifts to let you in. Basically, it's a counterweight on a pivot that enables you to fill your bucket with water and bring it with minimum effort. Shadufs are ingenious and they are so simple, but very, very, very crucial for work. So when you look at all of these inventions produced by the Sumerians, you can imagine a society that is extremely efficient in producing food, in creating an environment where population can grow. And this right here is the image of that an artist has imagined of a Sumerian village, let's say around 2500 BC. Along the river, there are boats transporting goods. You have canals opening into the rivers to bring water into the fields. You have oxen on the field, the land, the soil being prepared for the next harvest. You have a boy collecting dates. Dates, if you have eaten dates, they're extremely sweet. They're a tremendous source of sugar. Delicious, by the way. You can see farther along, you have a field, a meadow with sheep eating grass. And of course, the raising of sheep was extremely important for the Sumerians, even though they were no longer pastoralists. Animal husbandry was extremely important. And you have the dwellings made of mud brick with plaster. They have very simple structures, but they are perfectly built for the climate where they live. The Sumerians were able to succeed for thousands of years in producing a quality of living that was quite high for the time. Of course, great civilizations have to also be judged or analyzed or evaluated in terms of what they produce culturally, in terms of how they produce a view of life and the world, and how they're able to transmit that. One of the most important cultural contributions of the Sumerians was literature. They produce poetry, they produce stories, and these stories lived on in other civilizations. The civilizations that succeeded the Sumerians were able to feed from that foundation of culture that the Sumerians produced and take that to another level. The Epic of Gilgamesh is the first great work of literature in history. It was actually produced at the time of the Akkadians, who were a successor civilization to the Sumerians, and later on, the stories were reassembled into a full narrative. This is during the time of the Assyrians, yet another civilization. However, the original stories contained in the Epic of Gilgamesh go all the way back to Sumerian times. And they are part of what we call the Gilgamesh cycle, different stories that are connected to each other. An epic is a story about a hero and his ordeals and ultimate victory. In the case of Gilgamesh, we have a king, a Sumerian king, who was real. There was a historical Gilgamesh. Of course, all the stories that we hear about him are only part of the imagination of the authors of these stories. So it is a combination of bits of historical fact enhanced for artistic and literary purposes. The Gilgamesh from legend was a selfish and arrogant king. He didn't care about anything but his fame and satisfying his desires. And for that reason, the gods decided to punish him by sending a wild man by the name of Enkidu to teach him a lesson. Gilgamesh, who was very clever, tricks Enkidu and he wins the combat that they were supposed to have. But at the end of this, they gain respect of each other and they become friends. They become like brothers. And the plan of the gods turns upside down because now Gilgamesh has this wild man called Enkidu, and together they are going on a rampage. They're doing things that they're not supposed to do, like killing a sacred bull that belonged to the gods. So the gods decide to punish Gilgamesh once again, and this time they will do it by killing Enkidu. Enkidu is killed, and Gilgamesh is completely crushed emotionally by this. The loss of Enkidu forces him to question his own existence. Why are we here? What is the meaning of life? I wish I could never die. And this becomes an obsession. So he decides that he will find the secret of eternal life. And for that purpose, he has to find Utnapishtim. Utnapishtim is, according to the legend, the only human who, along with his wife, was granted immortality by the gods. He lives by the edge of the known world. And in order to get to him, Gilgamesh has to traverse the underworld, the world of the dead. So the whole story from this point on is about Gilgamesh and his quest to find Utnapishtim. And during this process, he has to face many obstacles. Eventually, he will find Utnapishtim, and at this point, he has to because it is the story of the flood. Utnapishtim was a man who lived in ancient Mesopotamia, and one day the gods, who get tired of the bickering of humans, decide that they are going to destroy the world. Actually, it is the god Enlil who gets really angry and says, I've had it with humans. And he decides to destroy the world by making it rain for 6 days, non-stop. But one god, Ea, who likes humans, decides to speak to Utnapishtim in a dream and tells him the world is going to be destroyed, get ready. Utnapishtim, who's very clever, builds a huge boat Uh, Inside the boat, he is going to have gold. That's the first thing that he puts in. Grain, tools. He's going to bring craftsmen. He's going to bring his family and his associates, people, probably members of his clan or tribe. When the flood begins, when it starts to rain and the land starts to flood, he and his people and the animals that he has brought, domestic animals as well as some wild animals, they are saved. And they remain there. He comes out of, he opens a hatch of the boat and he looks around and there's only silence, death, desolation, absolute silence. It's a very moving moment. And then he decides that he has to find land. So for 3 days, he sends birds to look for land. The first day, the bird returns because he doesn't find land. The second day, the bird returns with mud on its feet, and the third day, the bird doesn't return, which means that land has been that the land is drying. Utnapishtim finds a place to land. He offers a sacrifice to the gods, and Enlil, the king of the gods, is angry, so he condemns Utnapishtim and his wife to live forever. So immortality is not really a gift, it's more like a curse. In any case, Gilgamesh, who is going through the underworld, going through all of these ordeals, finally finds Utnapishtim, and Utnapishtim tells his story. Gilgamesh is given a test to see if he can stay awake for 6 days and six nights. He fails the test, so Utnapishtim says, "Sorry, but I cannot give you the secret for immortality. But I will tell you something. If you go to a place by the river, you will find you can dive deep into the river, and you will find a plant. If you eat from that plant, you will be young until the day you die." So Gilgamesh goes there. He dives, he retrieves the plant. He's exhausted because he has been holding his breath. So when he comes out, he puts the plant next to him while he's resting. And at that time, a snake comes and steals the plant. So poor Gilgamesh now has no immortality and no perpetual youth. So he has to go back to his city. But as he approaches his city, he realizes that he has been successful in his quest, because his quest has led him to realize that the meaning of life is not to live forever, that immortality is a curse and not a gift. The fact that we will die one day is the actual gift from the gods, because that makes every single moment that we live precious. He remembers the words of an innkeeper by the name of Siduri. During his adventure, he met her. He was very tired. And Siduri told Gilgamesh, "Why are you on this crazy quest, Gilgamesh? Instead, you should go home. Embrace your wife. Kiss your children. Be good to your people. Drink. Fill your belly with food. Be happy." That is the message of the story, that we have to value each moment of our lives as if it is the last. We will not be here forever. We will not be young forever. We have to embrace the little joys in life. Kissing our children, embracing our wives and husbands, enjoying a nice beer. By the way, the Sumerians also were great producers of beer. Having a nice meal with people that you love and you care about. That's what is important. Find meaning in every little thing that you do. And only when you realize that, then you can say, "I have accomplished what I was here to accomplish." In the case of Gilgamesh, he realizes that. And he knows that from this moment on, he will be a good father, he will be a good husband. And very important, he will be a good king for his people. And when time goes by and he dies, people will remember not that he built the great ramparts, the great walls of Uruk, or that he won battles. They will remember that he had to go through these ordeals, through the underworld, on behalf of humanity, to realize how gifted we are. Because the gods envy us. The gods live forever. For them, every minute is the same. There's no meaning, there's no excitement in their lives. But our lives are so meaningful at every single moment. But it took a hero, it took Gilgamesh, for us to know that. The story of Gilgamesh is actually a collection of tales. Uh, the original story comes from the time of the Sumerians. It was written at the time of the Akkadians, and later on during the time of the Assyrians, the story was reassembled. So it's actually what we call it a cycle. And the story of Utnapishtim